They want to see more border security, and they want to see getting the number of immigrants in the U.S. under control.
I think a plausible argument can be made that a lot of this is unjustified.
I think the elites overplayed their hand for too many years.
I've heard lots of statements that these are kind of more just like, joyous occasions to exercise free speech.
Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation, where we dive into alternative perspectives on politics, public policy, and current events. The date today is June 15th, and we're going to be discussing the No Kings protests, the unrest and anti-ICE protests in LA, and the various adjacent topics, military parade. We'll see exactly where the conversation takes us. But I'm joined today by Jeff Hall, who is the CEO and founder at Our National Conversation. He's been on a few podcasts. And Jeff, I just kind of want to start this conversation by asking, what's the atmosphere been like in LA over the past few days? I've seen lots of videos, news reports, and so forth, but to hear it from someone who's just a resident of the area and has been there, over the past week or so, what's it been like?
Well, I live in the Brentwood section of Los Angeles, which is 13 miles away from downtown. And so I have not seen nor felt anything directly. My wife does work downtown, and she's heard the protests, during the day for several days now, but she hasn't seen any violence or any graffiti or anything like that. Although we've all seen pictures, we're definitely seeing news coverage. I'm part of a Facebook group where people are taking some pictures of downtown Los Angeles, of the old Los Angeles Times building where I used to work. It got graffitied pretty hard the other day, and everybody is pretty upset about that. I don't know. It's like in LA we have a lot of Mexicans and other ethnic groups highly represented in our city, and I'm quite sure many of them are undocumented. And yet they're just an integral part of our local economy. They work in the restaurants, they wash the dishes, they do the gardening, they're big in the construction trade. Up in the Central Valley of California, which is our agriculture area, which is also very Republican, they work the fields, they pick the fruit, they pick the vegetables. I've often wondered how our local economy would even function if the Trump people were successful in sending even half of them home. Although I know there's a news flash now, apparently just yesterday, or maybe the day before, he said he is reconsidering sending back manual labor types because he's starting to understand that these people are very key and important to the hospitality trade and agriculture, which, I don't know, it's like, I can't imagine he didn't understand this before, or nobody told him this before, but I'm glad to see that he's doing a course correction here.
Yeah, although that sort of, I guess, transactionalism certainly doesn't apply to, maybe like students here on visas and other individuals who, have been detained in the past, especially with respect to Israel and Palestine, that whole issue. And those broader subjects seem to play heavily into the wider kind of No Kings protests movement. So, obviously we had this massive organization of protests across the country occurring largely yesterday during Trump's military parade in Washington, D.C. And these other protests, they didn't occur in D.C., but were just across in other major cities, and seemed to just be compiling a lot of different I guess, resentments against the administration that a lot of people are having. Obviously, in LA, the major point was, the immigration debate. It was undocumented immigrants. It was ICE raids, things like that. And that kind of may have been the instigating factor here. But if you see interviews of people in these other protests, they reference, things like how Medicaid's doing. They reference what they see as abuses of power. They reference, Israel and Palestine. They reference LGBTQIA plus issues. There seems to be just a constellation of a ton of different, grievances here. So I'm curious, Jeff, in LA, are you kind of seeing, with just whatever exposure you have, that same degree of just sort of a, as I said, this constellation of a bunch of different resentments against the administration, or is it almost just like, no, here it's almost solely the focus is immigration and those issues? Um,
Oh, I think it's definitely the full gamut of issues. I just read a poll this morning saying something like 60% of the American people actually agree with Trump and his goals. They want to see more border security, and they want to see getting the number of immigrants in the U.S. under control. They also agree with the tariff idea that we should rebalance the balance of trade and get some of these trade deficits under control. But another 60% come at it from a different angle, and they say, even though we agree with the goals, we really don't like the way he's going about doing it. And I think there's something about this administration in particular, there's a mean-spiritedness. They seem to enjoy and thrive on poking people, and it feels like they're uh, picking a fight here almost in every angle you want to look. And I don't know how it's going to play out because I think at some point the Supreme Court is going to have to decide either Trump gets, a green light to do everything he wants, or they're going to have to stand up and say, enough is enough. You can't go beyond this anymore. But then I think what happens next is the way things seem to be shaping up is I think even if he's told by the Supreme Court that he can't go any further here, I think he's going to keep going anyway to see how far he can go.
yeah, yeah, no, I mean, kind of a few points to touch on there. As far as the kind of mean-spiritedness, I mean, I think you just have to go on the social media to see that sort of thing. Just the like the various posts that are made by the White House and various executive agencies, with memes. Or a little while back, I know this garnered a lot of notoriety or kind of notoriousness. There was like an ASMR like deportation video or something. It's just kind of like the audio of the chains and so forth. People being moved out, undocumented immigrants, that sort of thing. So yeah, it is. It's sort of like a I don't know. At least from what I'm seeing, it seems that there is kind of this spectacle of, malice in a lot of ways. Though I want to be, careful in sort of acknowledging maybe the conservative perspective here and trying to understand it, because I probably classify myself as something like maybe a moderate progressive. Jeff, I've heard you kind of label yourself as sort of a centrist or kind of heavy there in the political moderation. So we don't really have a MAGA conservative represented in the conversation here today. So maybe there's something to be said for, like, if you believe there's been this progressive elite that's been, in charge for a very long time, and there's been tons of abuses of power, unjustified and so forth, and there's the security issue with undocumented immigrants, and finally it's being resolved. Maybe you take some joy in that, and maybe there's a way to interpret some of this that's a little less malicious. But when I see these memes and videos being posted by the administration, I maybe have a little hard time seeing, that side of things and that take.
I've got some MAGA friends, and they are taking some joy in all of this. I think, Alex Padilla, who's our elected U.S. Senator from California, he's of Hispanic roots, was wrestled to the ground recently in a federal office building here in LA. And people here, my MAGA friends, thought it was great. He was making a spectacle of himself. He was trying to interrupt her press conference. That's all they needed to know to think it was okay to push him to the ground. But in my lifetime, I'm 73 now. I've never seen a time when an administration felt it was necessary to physically take on, an elected official this way. It was just like, whoa, I've just never seen this before. Um, I've got another friend who runs one of the local restaurants here in Brentwood, who's Hispanic, and his whole staff is Hispanic. And I saw him the other night, and I said, "How are you being affected by this?" He said he's definitely being affected. Workers who used to show up are no longer showing up. He said he had a friend who was running a food truck in LA, and the other day ICE came by and just snatched up everybody who was working at the food truck, and off they went, and they just left the food truck there empty and abandoned. And nobody knows yet, what's going to happen to these people because nobody's heard from them. I mean, I don't think it has to be this way. I think there ought to be more of a process. I think if the administration is going after people, they should prioritize criminals and bad guys and drug dealers and all those types, and go after them first. But the hardworking Mexican people who just do the daily awful work that gringos don't want to do, I don't know why we're going after them. It just doesn't make any sense to me. It seems impractical. It seems like a lot of the hard work that needs to get done won't be getting done.
I'd be really interested to see kind of, and maybe there's some documentation of this, that journalists and so forth dig into, but just what the logistics are like behind the scenes, in ICE and other agencies that are relevant to these processes. Like how they go about choosing people. Is it just like a situation where we've managed to see, hey, these people are undocumented or seem to be undocumented, so let's just go get them. Maybe there's not really a list of like, here's all the undocumented people, let's prioritize the criminals. Maybe it's just a sort of like, I don't know, kind of a more haphazard process based on limited information. I'm curious to see exactly what that looks like, and what the policy implications of that are, like whether there is another way to go about this that would accomplish the administration's goals, or at least maybe the goals that align with what 60% of Americans want. That's more efficient, that's more reasonable, that's less of a drain on resources. I just be curious to dig into something like that.
Yeah, I don't think there's a list. Every day we see reports. They go to Home Depots. We have Home Depot stores here in LA where a lot of the workers, the day workers, who maybe half of them are undocumented. I don't know, but they hang out there hoping that somebody will drive by and say, "We've got a job for you today." It could be construction, it could be cleaning out an office building, it could be landscaping, it could be anything. Hard work. And these people don't show up anymore because they're afraid that they're going to get picked off by ICE. I understand ICE has even gone to um, local public schools, and they hang out there, and a lot of the parents are afraid to drop their kids off. There's just a lot of fear. I think fear is a bad thing. You know, in business, it's often said fear is the enemy of creativity. That if you have a corporate culture where people are afraid to speak their minds, then they hold back, and they only tell the boss what the boss wants to hear, and they don't want to come forward with new ideas because they might get in trouble for it. It feels like that's happening in our whole society right now, and I for one don't like it. I think it's not the America I grew up in.
No, I completely agree with that. And maybe to broaden out to other areas that touch on this subject. I there has obviously been some sort of change in kind of dialogue and how it's carried out. Let's just take American universities as an example, right? We could also go to maybe corporations, things like that, but we'll just start with universities. It almost seems like there's been I don't know, maybe the way to put this is kind of a reverse freeze on a lot of academic discourse, at least from what I'm seeing. Before there were a lot of conservative charges levied against academic institutions that, hey, it's kind of like this liberal hive mind or whatever. If you say something that's more conservative, you're going to be, kind of ostracized in various academic groups, especially among your peers. Um, maybe conservative faculty have a harder time getting published or something like that. There's disputes on that, and there's studies on this sort of thing that have mixed results. But at the very least, that was the charge, right? And I think especially on some campuses there was some truth to that. But now it seems like we're almost having this exodus of professors, grad students, and others who are just kind of leaving the country, pursuing work in Europe and Canada, because they they're worried, I'm not going to be able to effectively pursue research here because if I offer my honest opinions, my grants are going to be slashed, or, what kind of the funding that the school's getting for research that's being tanked. So you have to be really careful about what you say. And, just that alone, even ignoring all the other charges levied against the administration, I mean, that just seems very concerning to me. When you have an administration that's essentially, coming in, and this is just what seems to be the case given the information I have right now, and essentially saying, hey, if we don't really like what you're saying, we're going to cut your funding, so you should stop that. It's like before it was the culture of academia that may have been silencing, the free exchange of ideas and certain conservative points of view. But now it's almost as though it's the government itself, the federal government, or at least the executive branch, that is, really, I guess, diminishing this freedom of discourse and doing it in the reverse sense. Maybe hampering and posing obstacles to progressive points of view, or highly progressive points of view. Um, I don't know. Well, what are your thoughts on that, Jeff? Are you hearing anything from your friends? Seeing everything? Is this being overblown in the media? Are you not sure? I'm curious.
Well, I think conservatives in recent years have felt unwelcome on campuses. I mean, I've been told that directly by some of our student interns at our national conversation because we're always reaching out to conservatives because we want to maintain a balance in our group. In a perfect world, we'd have a third liberals, a third moderates, and a third conservatives, and we could all have, civil dialogue that's balanced and not angry. That's kind of our hallmark. But we don't have a full third of conservatives. We fall short of the mark there, and despite our best efforts, we never quite fill that gap up to the full capacity that we seek. And I've often wondered, why is that? And some of these conservatives tell me they think our national conversation sounds like a liberal idea because we want to have open dialogue where all points of view are welcome. I don't think of that as a liberal idea. That just seems to me to be a very American idea.
In fact, that
But a lot
seemed
of
to be an idea that was championed by a lot of conservative commentators, at least just a little bit ago.
yeah, yeah. But some of our conservative students have also said they really like our national conversation because they feel welcome here and it's okay for them to express their points of view and nobody comes down on them. So I'm proud of what we do. I just wish we could amp it up a little bit so that the rest of the country caught on to what we were doing and recognized it and joined the conversation. I think it will happen one day. I think people at some point are going to get so fed up with all of the anger and the bias in the media. I mean, think about it. Our media ecosystem, it's like they've all chosen sides. They're either right wing or left wing, but who's in the middle now, really? Just allowing all points of view to be stated. I'll answer my own question. There's a lady named Abby Phillip on CNN who tries to do this. She has like a roundtable discussion every night, and she has a mix of liberals, moderates, and conservatives. But unfortunately, within about 10 minutes or so of the 1 hour show, they all start yelling at each other and talking over each other. And they've got their talking points they want to make. And like as one person gets louder, the other person gets louder in order to be heard. And before you know it, I mean, I get a headache. I can't even listen to it. And we switch stations and that's that. I think it's a good idea. I think in the execution, unfortunately, I think Abby lets it get out of control. Now, I don't know what she can do. If I were Abby, in fact, I actually wrote her an email. I don't know if it ever got to her. I said, you should tell your guests that in the future, if they start doing this, yelling and over talking the other people, you should just tell them they'll never be invited back again. And I think that would do a lot to calm people down and become more measured in their discussions. Like Sam, we have discussions just like this all the time. We never yell at each other. It's just not necessary.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose we also have the benefits of our discussions, usually being people who've, freely elected to join ONC, who work with us, and they're kind of committed to that mission, as a whole. Whereas otherwise, it's that issue of, say I'm a highly progressive person. Sorry, for some reason the light's weird on my camera now. but I'm a highly progressive individual, and I'm looking at everything that's happening, and I see the Trump administration and the MAGA movement as an existential threat to democracy. And that kind of, this isn't a necessary move, but it kind of automatically translates to, and I have to basically shout them down, do everything I can to stop these people from, having a platform, kind of having that voice. It's because it's destructive to the American project, and vice versa. I think with this goes back to the campus discussion. I think maybe what you have here among some conservatives is, they sort of see, college campuses and other things like corporations, that are pandering to progressive movements and so forth, or were a little while ago, and see, okay, conservative perspectives are being silenced. There's this sort of existential threat to the free exchange of ideas, on campuses. There's this freezing of, alternative perspectives, especially conservative perspectives. What do we have to do? We have to fix that. And, what does that entail? Well, that entails slashing funding to, the various liberal arts programs. That entails, kind of taking the fight against these progressives who are silencing us, etc. And then what you start to have is you easily go too far, where now you're silencing, discourse and alternative perspectives. It's just the other side now that's taking the brunt of it. And maybe a similar thing with corporate environments. You have this very strong focus on, hey, don't say anything, against, the sort of, I guess, progressive orthodoxy that exists. And now, given that Trump's in office, it's almost the reverse. Like, maybe you talk about DEI too much, you're going to start jeopardizing us or our image a little bit. Let's kind of put a cap on that a bit. This is just sort of the atmosphere that I'm collecting from the news media, from people I talk to. I don't know, like, statistically how much, of this silencing of dialogue is occurring now, in this reverse sense, against progressives in corporations, on campuses. But I don't know. That's just the sense I get, sort of an overcorrection.
Yeah, no, no, no. I mean, I'll tell you an example. So Trump and his guys get into office, his guys and gals, and they go after military officials who were promoting DEI initiatives, and they all got fired. Well, was it their fault? I mean, they were following orders, as far as I'm concerned, during the Biden administration. Maybe the Biden team went way overboard with DEI. I'm not going to argue that one. But I don't think these people who carried out those policies should be blamed and have their careers terminated simply because they were doing what the commander in chief wanted them to do. So it seems very unfair to me that the people who were promoting DEI are suddenly now, thrown to the side. I'll give you another example. This is so ridiculous. My daughter is a zoo professional, and several years ago, she worked at a zoo in Chicago, and she's got a PhD in primatology, which is the study of apes and monkeys. And she participated in the writing of an academic paper that talked about the importance of diversity in activity for animals. Like, so during the day, you don't want them just to sit there in a cage. You want to let them get out and walk about, and create activities for them so that they can run around and jump on trees and climb things and do whatever they do, to make them feel like they're back in the jungle, rather than in behind bars. Well, she no longer works at that zoo, but she was told a few months ago that one of her partners who helped write the paper had his federal funding terminated because he didn't know why, but they know why, because somewhere in that paper, the word diversity showed up. Somebody did a global search, probably the Doge people, and they saw the word diversity, and therefore the program was terminated. Now, why the federal government is funding zoos, I don't know. There must have been some reason. That's another debate that we could have. But I think just to do it with such a bludgeon is stupid. I think it makes the Trump people look dumb, and I think for their own PR, they ought to be going about this in a much more thoughtful way.
Yeah, yeah. And I can see, like, I can see kind of in some respects both sides of the argument here. Jeff, you kind of mentioned maybe maybe there wasn't a super great reason for the federal government to be funding a zoo or something like that, right? Maybe it's better that that's funded in some other way. And so as conservatives make this argument, we need to cut funding to these, maybe university programs, other public works programs, et cetera, that maybe don't have a clear direct benefit on the taxpayers who are giving that money. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe the federal government, it needs to cut spending. We need to address the deficit. The big beautiful bill, of course, isn't really doing that. But at the very least, it's cutting spending to a number of programs, and maybe we need to keep moving in that direction, right? And so if you're taking that approach, I can sort of see the argument, and I think a plausible argument can be made there. Um, but I think part of the issue here is with the way that grants and federal money have been set up, in relation to universities. It's sort of like the those programs that expect like expression have become dependent, right, on that federal money, on those taxpayer dollars, and the situation that creates is it becomes very, very easy to weaponize those cuts and target cut like sort of programs that you just ideologically don't like, while not targeting as much programs that you're kind of ideologically okay with. It's not about just like an economic analysis, what's the best use of taxpayer funds here. It can very easily become Trump doesn't like X, Y, and Z people, so their grants are being slashed. And it's when we enter into that territory that I think things become really concerning, and that we start to enter into a mitigation of the free expression of ideas of especially with research programs and grants and that sort of thing. I'll give kind of one example. I don't know all the particulars and the history here, but I do know, I believe this was in Turkey. Um, Essentially what had happened when extensive democratic backsliding was occurring, Turkey was becoming more authoritarian, is the dictator essentially just slashed funding to a lot of kind of public works and news media that were kind of allied in some way with the opposition, right? And so it became very, very targeted. And you can frame that as just, well, it's a more efficient use of money. But the effect it had was it essentially silenced discussion and gave that particular autocrat more power. I just worry that something like that could easily happen, here in the United States, and maybe not to the same extent, but I think a lot of people are worried that we're tending in that direction. And I guess that gets into the larger charge levied by the No Kings protest movements. You see tons of signs. The Trump administration is fascist, or I mean, just the name of the protest, No Kings. So I'm curious. Do you think that this weaponization is occurring, that it represents a shift towards authoritarianism, that our democracy is under threat by the administration's activities? Do you think that's maybe overblown? Maybe it's, I don't know, somewhere in the middle, or maybe there's multiple possibilities. There's so much competing information, it's hard to parse through what's actually happening here. I'm just curious, Jeff, where's your headspace at? I'm trying to collect as many different perspectives on this as I can.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. My head spins on a daily basis. It's really hard to keep up with everything. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, and even I'm like with those other Americans I mentioned earlier. I can understand why we want to get immigration under control. I can understand why we want to have balanced trade. I can understand a lot of things that Trump wants to do. I don't understand the mean-spiritedness of it, and that to me feels very authoritarian. Like, you go along with what we want, or we're gonna beat the crap out of you. It's just it doesn't have to be this way, I don't think. I think the chilling effect has already occurred. It's already occurring. I think media outlets are pulling way back in their criticism of Trump. I think universities are towing the line. I think people in the military, whatever Trump wants, he's going to get it. Um, Nobody's pushing back. The pushback is within the administration. Nobody's pushing back. Well, you know what? I'm going to take that back. I heard that it was actually the Department of Agriculture secretary, whose name I don't know. who just the other day went to Trump and said, you really don't want to send all these farm workers back to Mexico. It'll really hurt the agricultural economy. And he had an impact. So Trump maybe, being the transactional guy he is open to bargaining, provided that the logic is there. I'm just not sure how many people are willing to stand up to him and provide an alternative point of view. It doesn't seem like too many, but I congratulate this Secretary of Agriculture. I think he did something good here.
Yeah, no, that's great. But yeah, I think that it's we could get into like debates, and I'd love to have a MAGA conservative in the room so we can debate each of these points more thoroughly. But I just created a list of some things here that I'm seeing mentioned time and again that people reference when they say the Trump administration is increasingly authoritarian. They mention one, unjustified or vague detention of individuals, especially immigrants. Now, I know that conservatives, oftentimes will respond to that and say, well, a lot of these people are either undocumented or they're on visas, they're not U.S. citizens, and they don't necessarily have a right to be here in the country. And so if they're engaging in behavior that's like disruptive or whatever else, then the government has a legitimate interest in deporting these individuals. So I think we could get into a debate on those individual points there. But at the very least, this is a concern that's being levied a lot, and I think a plausible argument can be made that a lot of this is unjustified. There's messy relationship with the courts, rhetoric that unjustly undermines institutional legitimacy of the courts. We see this a lot in cases of democratic backsliding, where you have sort of a democracy, but the institutions are gradually whittled away. Trump, is constantly calling, the judges radical, left-wing, communist, Marxist, rogue judges, just because they do something that he doesn't really like. And that rhetoric alone, I think, is quite concerning. And you see this sort of thing a lot, with the Trump crowd there. And transactional and personalized uses of power. We can go back to the DOJ and the Eric Adams debacle, that happened a little while back. We mentioned already this sort of reverse freeze on free speech that seems to be occurring. And again, we can get into the specifics on that. And a lot of these points are debatable, but I'm just trying to kind of summarize the case here against the administration. Stolen election rhetoric. This is going back obviously to 2020, but that still carries over. When we lose, it's because it's rigged. And then of course there's the whole January 6th thing that happened a little while back. So there's probably numerous other points, but these are sorts of the main things that I'm seeing, for time and again. And I don't know, Jeff. It's because the thing that I'm running into, it's exactly what you said. Every day there's just an overload of information. Because it's in news stories and videos and interviews, it has to be presented in a really condensed fashion. So you don't get all the details, you don't get all the nuance. It's really hard to parse what's going on behind the scenes. And as such, each of these points can be debated. So I don't know that I would conclude, yes, the Trump administration is authoritarian, or I would especially hesitate to call it fascist, because I think there's a more robust definition that needs to be made there.
Sam, don't say the word fascist. Don't call him a Nazi. If there's one way you want to inflame the right-wing MAGA crowd, it's by engaging in those kinds of name calling. Then they really get offended, and then they really do want to fight back. I think we all ought to be careful. I would say to the left-wingers who are joining these protests downtown, the protests are supposed to be against ICE. But you have a lot of people there, waving Palestinian flags. You have people with Mexican flags. All these different causes get thrown in to the mix. I personally think it's bad PR for the left to do this because it draws attention away from what the initial purpose was. These ICE raids. They inflame things rather than calm things down.
Yeah. So a few things on that. Jeff, I completely agree on the fascist point. I see this term thrown around a lot, and fascism has always been thrown around a lot. It's become a sort of political buzzword. But I think if you want to label something as fascist, you have to demonstrate that it's it's just a first pass on a definition here. It's ultra nationalist. It's a sort of militant expansionism, right? Let's put military boots on the ground to go and conquer some place, generate the living space and so forth. It has to have some like ideological racial hierarchy or something along the lines of that, some severe social stratification. And it's got to have like a robust commitment to like a full-on dictatorship, right? Not something that's democratic but is engaging in some abuses of power or maybe engaging in democratic backsliding. Like a robust dictatorship, right? In order to be labeled fascist. That's the definition I'm using. People have other definitions. And I guess you can redefine terms however you want, and then you'll be correct as long as you're clear about what you're using the term to define. But I mean, if we're saying those factors are needed in order to call something fascist, I do not think the Trump administration is fascist. I think that's, as you said, it's something that it creates hyperbole. It's kind of blows things out of proportion, and it doesn't allow level heads to prevail and actually dissect. Okay, what's happening here? Is our democracy under threat, or is it not? If it is under threat, what exactly does that threat look like? If you blow things out of proportion, it diminishes your credibility, and suddenly people don't take maybe the justified charges you're levying against the administration, certain authoritarian practices it is engaging in, seriously anymore, right? Because they think you're saying something absolutely ludicrous. So that's just my current perspective on the subject there.
Well, I think the ultimate test will come in 2028. Trump tries to come up with some reason why it's okay for him to run for a third term. That to me is going to be a very scary day because, we have a precedent of 2 terms and then you're out. There are plenty of other conservatives in the MAGA movement who could move up and take over, claim that he can hold on to a third term or even cancel elections. That could spell the end of the American experiment as we have. That would be very frightening for me, and I think there would be a huge uprising at that point.
Oh, definitely. No, and to clarify, even though I don't think, based on the current information I have and the definitions that I'm using, that the Trump administration can be labeled as fascist accurately, I do think a plausible case can be made that we are seeing democratic backsliding, which just basically means like the erosion of certain democratic norms, and it's easier for individuals to engage in authoritarian-esque practices, right? Abuses of power and so forth. And that maybe we're sliding towards something that political scientists refer to as competitive authoritarianism. It's sort of like an extreme example of this would be Russia, right? You have elections, you have democratic institutions and so forth, but they're heavily weighted towards one side, or they're weaponized in ways that they shouldn't be, to benefit certain people in office, etc. And those are the sorts of charges that I think could potentially be levied against the current administration. And I'd really like to dig into that subject with people from a broad range of perspectives and really dig into the nuances of the information because, just going back to that original point, there's just so much being thrown in our media saturated environment and so many competing stories and narratives, competing takes on the same information. It's really hard to get straight what's actually happening here. And I mean, those are the sorts of circumstances in which authoritarian movements, if they exist, do thrive.
I think Trump, just his persona, it is all about the personal power and the glory and the aggrandizement and the money. If those things come together in a way that benefits him, he's all for it. Um, I just, I don't know. I wish he could take some of his common sense ideas. I think he does have some common sense ideas. I think he's got a real facility for reaching out to the underdogs of America, people who have lost their jobs to China in recent decades, people who live in communities where there's a lot of opioid abuse, people who felt like they were equal participants in the American experiment at one point who no longer feel that way. I mean, he's got a populist thing going on here that I get. I think the elites overplayed their hand for too many years and made a lot of people in America feel dumb and left out and lesser than, they were the basket of deplorables and all that. That kind of rhetoric on the left did not help the left. So I don't know. I just hope that in coming decades, people are going to get burnt out and exhausted by all the fighting, and that they will just say, it doesn't have to be this way. How did America heal itself after the Civil War? That would be a very interesting historical analysis to hear. At some point, America became united and happy, but obviously they had to go through hell before they got there. So, given that we've been here before in a place of mutual hatred, somehow or another we overcame that before. So that gives me hope that we can overcome it again.
Yeah. No, I think we have to maintain that hope. Because otherwise it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If we claim there's really no way to resolve the hatred, extreme polarization, and an atmosphere that might catalyze, the sort of violent behavior and democratic backsliding, etc., then we there's nobody that's really standing up to it, and thus it just continues unchecked. Um,
I think what Trump really likes to do is be the center of attention, and every day he'll throw something out there that gets everybody in a tizzy. And then a day or two later, he'll change the subject by throwing another hand grenade into the mix. Um, so it's all about ratings. He likes being the center of attention. He likes people talking about him, whether it's good or bad or ugly or indifferent. You know, he's got to control the conversation. He's quite brilliant at that. Um, but it becomes exhausting. Is it really good for America to throw this much at us this quickly? And by the way, I view myself as an innovator. I hang out with Silicon Valley types, and they're always talking about disruption and how cool that is. I get it. There are a lot of old ways of doing things that ought to be challenged, but I don't get the logic behind his challenge. It's just sort of like, let me see if I can mess it up, piss people off. Let's see what I can get away with. And then if I get too much pushback, then I guess I'll relent, like he did with the farm workers recently. I think even with the tariffs, when he first started all the tariffs, the stock market was tanking, the bond market was saying to him, you've gone too far. He backed off. So that's the thing about Trump. People fear him and they think he's a dictator and a fascist and all that good stuff. But in reality, there is that taco factor. Trump always chickens out, and we've seen it now time and time again. So he he's not as tough as he wants us to think he is. That's my opinion.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think what we have to do is what I think a lot of people are doing. It's just keeping a close eye on the things that the administration is doing, and maybe acknowledging the reasonableness of some of the policy objectives, but really paying attention to those means, and seeing, is this an abuse of power or is it not? I think we, just as the American people, we really need to stay on top of that, and really digging into the nuances of these policy moves, et cetera. And it's difficult, it's hard, it's exhausting, but I think that if we do see something that is an obvious abuse of power, it's there needs to be that pushback, there needs to be that check on it, and then hopefully that itself is kind of enough to get a slight pullback from the administration if something like that does occur or is occurring.
Well, I think one of the frustrations for people who aren't fans of Trump is that they don't know what to do. You know, what can they do to stop this or to voice their protest? A lot of people went downtown in recent days hoping to, make a statement, but the whole um, operation has been messed up because people are spraying graffiti on buildings, breaking windows, waving flags of foreign countries. That doesn't help. I guarantee you that doesn't help. So there's got to be a better way to protest. Maybe the day will come when there'll just be a general strike and the whole country says, we're not going to work tomorrow. And then what's going to
Well, on that note, I will say, you know, it seems like from what I'm reading, most of the No Kings protests have been peaceful and have gone without much incident. Obviously there's, instances of graffiti and people pushing past police lines, so some people arrested, etc. But I mean, estimates put about like 5 million people across the US participating in these protests. And the vast majority of them are just people, going down a street, chanting, playing music. I've heard lots of statements that these are kind of more just like, joyous occasions to exercise free speech, the foundational bedrock for our country. So I think some of that is occurring, but it's easily drowned out by the instances where that doesn't happen, right? Where there is looting, or there is violence, or there's, tear gas or chemical irritants, otherwise being shot into the crowds, etc.
You know, I'll give Trump a little bit of credit here. A lot of liberals were freaking out about this military parade. Oh my God, this is a horrible waste of money and it's all about Trump's ego, et cetera, et cetera. I tuned in and watched part of it yesterday. I actually thought it was pretty good. And I think it was a good way to celebrate the Army and their 250th birthday. And when you think about the soldiers and what they do, the sacrifices they make to keep America safe and free, and they're good people. I've worked with military people before. They're organized. They're efficient. They get things done. It's all about making things work. And I think our society could actually learn quite a bit from the military. But so I personally thought the parade was fine.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of very divergent narratives on the parade. On the left, I'm seeing some people, say, no, this is just sort of a vulgar, attempt at demonstrating America's military might in the same fashion you would see, Putin or Kim Jong-un, or Xi Jinping, engage in with their various military parades. But then I'm seeing other people, if you just have like that, there's that historical section of the parade, right? It goes through the various, stages of the American military. They're dressed in the historically accurate uniforms, and I'm seeing comments on videos. It's just sort of celebrating, like irrespective of politics and ideology, people who've sacrificed for the good of the country, or at the very least what they thought was the good of the country, at the time. So I don't know. It's just another case where there's these completely divergent narratives looking at the same thing in a completely different way. And, it's I think it's a useful exercise, to just look at those, completely contradictory narratives, and then go to the original, the military parade, watch the footage, and come to a judgment yourself. I don't know. That's just, I think, the whole narrative that I'm personally experiencing here. It's just that those divergent worlds that are looking at the Trump administration, looking at the state of America, and yeah, I don't know. It's just it's difficult to try to parse through what's happening, but I think the act of trying and looking at those wildly divergent perspectives is itself useful, at least for me. Um, you know,
Well,
I
you're a
just
very,
hate to be lodged in like kind of a single narrative that
yeah,
I don't know.
you're a very reasonable person, and you try to see all sides, which makes you a little bit unusual, perhaps. Although I'm convinced there are a lot of people in the middle who do try to see all sides, and they'd be willing to forge reasonable compromises, but they don't want to speak up in today's environment. Because they're moderate people, they have a moderate personality. They don't want to get into fights with people, and I completely get that. You know, I end up in these discussions with both my liberal friends and my MAGA friends that can become pretty heated, and I'm trying to explain to them what the other side is saying. I'm not necessarily saying it. I'm just the messenger here, but they get angry about it. So we have two sides that despise each other, and in their perfect world, it's almost like death to the enemy. I don't feel that way. I feel like we're all Americans, and there's got to be a way that we can figure this out. And so maybe what we're doing here at our national conversation, Sam, is just keeping a flicker of hope alive, just a little ember. And then one day we can, get the campfire going again and we can all gather around and sing Kumbaya. That might not happen for many decades, but um, somebody's got to do what we're doing. And the more our country seems divided, the more I think there's a role for us to play.
Hmm. No, I agree with what you said there, Jeff. And I'll just add, this goes back to a conversation we had in a past podcast a little while ago. But I think there's a misperception. Um, and I would imagine that one can be very, very strongly opinionated. Like, say, I'm a progressive, say, I believe that the Trump administration is an existential threat to democracy. Say, I'm participating in the No Kings protest. Say, I'm engaging in activist work for certain policies, that will promote a very, very progressive agenda, combat almost everything that the Trump administration is doing. Even if I am that person, I don't know why I can't sit down and just, for my own benefit, try to understand where a MAGA conservative is coming from. It doesn't prevent me from engaging in that activism, from trying to protect American democracy as I see it. It just allows me to better understand another perspective, look at the facet of an issue that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, and be better for it. To really just understand, is there something here that I'm missing? And if there isn't, at least let me understand the opposing side or sides more, so I can, more effectively and more responsibly engage in activism against it. I think that if we could have that mentality where these sides that are really partisan are still willing to sit down and have a discussion for the sake of their own activism, for the sake of their own, benefit. I don't know. I feel like that could go a long way. And maybe I'm naive and this is wishful thinking and that's not really how it works. It's entirely possible, but I don't know. I just feel like that is something that's feasible, but it's just not something that the where we're accustomed to doing, or our current political environment really, enables us to do effectively.
Well, I'm older than you are, Sam, but when I was your age, the two parties did come together and they did make compromises. Richard Nixon was very unpopular in my era, and a lot of the same charges were levied against him that you hear levied against Trump today, that he was authoritarian and a power monger and a warmonger and all that stuff. Um, but he was embroiled in a scandal called Watergate, which by today's standards seems pretty tame, but we were all very upset about it at the time. But it was a bunch of Republicans who marched from, they didn't march, they probably had a limousine take them, but they went from Capitol Hill, some senators and congressmen on the Republican side who went to the White House to inform Richard Nixon that if he didn't resign, he would be impeached and he would be convicted. And it was at that point that Richard Nixon stepped down. So it wasn't just Democrats yelling at Richard Nixon and saying how much they hated him. It wasn't like that in those days. We had a mix of uh, ideologies. We had conservative Democrats, we had liberal Republicans. Somehow or another, they were able to talk in those days. And during Ronald Reagan's administration, he famously got together often and socialized with Tip O'Neill, who was the Democratic Speaker of the House. Now, they fought all day long like cats and dogs when it came to policy, but then at night they'd get together for cocktails. And, you know, it just, I miss it. I really do. And I hope that in your lifetime, anyway, you see that kind of spirit return.
Yeah. Well, let's hope we're able to attain something like that. And let's work towards it as best we can. But we're running out of time here, so I think we're probably gonna have to call the conversation here. But Jeff, thank you for coming on, for sharing your perspective here, and just helping me kind of dig into some of this and really try to understand what's going on. I feel like having these conversations with as many people as possible, it's probably the best route to try to wrap your head around the current state of America and how we move forward.
Don't give up.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everyone who's listening. If you enjoy this conversation, then please leave a like, comment below your thoughts. How can we improve these sorts of things? What are your thoughts on what we discussed? The No Kings protests, the LA protests, whether the Trump administration can be aptly characterized as authoritarian, and to what degree. just all of this stuff. And yeah, we just want to consult as many perspectives as possible on this. So thank you again, and we'll see you guys next week.
See you, Sam.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.